wanted to start with a provocative principle, which is the inefficiency principle, that innovation and efficiency are two opposable objectives. You cannot increase one without decreasing the other. So anybody who's come from a big corporate background knows about efficiency and how much of an imperative there is on efficiency. But when you start trying to introduce innovation concepts, you're thereby reducing efficiency on your path towards creating something novel. And there's a culture conflict that happens because most of our training is around the efficiency that we have in life. And so I've ran across this. Blair Inns pushed this out a couple months ago. And I've just found it really strikes so much of what we try to get at with lean prototyping. And so one, I just wanted to throw this out there to get some reactions to this, because sure, we have this imperative to go drive towards efficiency, but in startup world, that's not always the case. And I think that mindset can actually be damaging towards the success of your innovation program. Joe, what do you think?
I found it interesting enough to take a snapshot of it to share. I've never seen that term before, and it's intriguing. I mean, I never thought of it that way.
Yeah, it speaks to, I think, just the conflict you have and the natural tension we have when, like, and then you're also trying to apply an efficiency lens, because we were doing a teardown of a series of prototypes we had done. And so the series of unmet needs that were addressed with the first prototype was incomplete. By the time we got to the fourth prototype, it was almost complete and almost perfect. And the efficient person in the room asked, well, why didn't you just solve for all of those points in the first prototype?
Jeff Gable.
You're efficient, like, then yeah, you know. But like, if you've actually done innovation, you don't know if you actually have something. You want to control risk by trying to test against the the key points that could fail before then building a more elaborate, more expensive prototype. Mm-hmm. David has his hand raised.
Yeah, hi. Great slide. Another axis would be cost, and that fluctuates along that line too. Where the closer you get into trying to be more innovative, you're driving at cost in that perspective too. Having come from a big corporate background, so.
Yeah, did you read the next slide that I have?
Oh,
okay. That's absolutely right. Yeah, thank you, David. And Andrea?
Yeah, I mean, this rings so true, and I wish I think I'm going to use it with your permission too, because when people try to tie in patents into the innovation process, it's very much the same thing. And even people who are familiar with patents and know, okay, you should do an FTO or whatever, they just want to check one box, get it done, have clearance. And it doesn't work that way, especially when you're coming up with something truly new. There are several phases, and just like your prototyping, usually you have to tie it in at each step of the prototyping process. And there's so much frustration that it's not efficient, and you have to redo it over and over again. And I completely see this very clearly.
And
yeah,
that's what as a conference producer, I often, which topics do I include this year or not? And personally, I typically find that the IP talk is one that I'm like, well, it could kind of go either way. I've had great speakers, Greg Grissett is coming back, Stephen Carter, just a number of times over the last 10 years. This year, it's really going to be acute. Dave Albert is coming back, our keynote from last year. And if you've been following him in the paper at all, his IP battle with Apple is epic. It even went as far as the executive branch this week. Now, few of us play in that realm, but there must be some lessons for us folk as well. Nellie, you had something.
One of the things that I'm struggling with one of my other clients is the creativity of the prototype. And it's like they're so focused on the nuances that they're not getting through some of the basic stuff to get the software in a state where you can actually say, I actually have a working prototype. They got it working, but like a tiny piece works, and then they have to adjust it. And they're like, see, it's successful, but I have to manipulate it to be successful. So it's like, how do you manage those creative types who can't stop creating on the nuanced stuff and not realize they've got to go look at the basic stuff and get that working too?
Yeah, I mean, that's, we focus purely on desirability first of, is there a compelling problem? And then do we have a series of compelling solutions? Let's just focus on desirability first. And then feasibility and viability in terms of business model, that comes down the road. But, just purely focused on, is there, value here? And that's that's, it's very easy to get stuck going down a technical rabbit hole, and having that discipline to avoid the rabbit hole too early in the process. It's important eventually, yes, but not at that early stage. So yeah.
Now you've been amply rewarded. You said you wanted interaction.
Yeah, this is
On
fantastic.
slide 1.
I've got more
I know
slides
you
to
do.
possibly cover.
Mr.
Let's
Stockton.
it's the conversation that's the value here. So Rick, you've got a hand raised.
Yeah, and tell me if I'm getting ahead of us, but a lot of times people feel like, well, you can have a degree of efficiency in the innovation process, but that's really almost a derivative. That's taking a step back. That's having some order or some set of priorities in your innovation process. That's not really efficiency. That's just innovating better.
Yeah, I mean, there's a logic to good innovation, and there's excelling at running a good innovation process. And then there's an efficient process that, is your Six Sigma continuous process improvement, line extension, that it's safe and it's not very risky, but is it innovative? Well, then that's a question, right? And so there's degrees of it, right? And so at the same time, like if you're too innovative, maybe to Nellie's point, then you never actually capture any value out of it. And you're just perpetually generating ideas, and none of it actually converts to something that generates a profit. So you need to be able to swing both ways and be able to, figure out where along the continuum we need to be. And there's different skill sets at different points in time. So, but it kind of depends on where you want to go. So, all right. So next one is, have you ever seen those demotivational posters?
Mm-hmm.
That, it could be that the only purpose in your life is to serve as a warning to others. So it's kind of like pose this question of, why do startups fail? Right. And so this is one that, if you follow CB Insights, they go through and they survey startups who the founders, as they're shutting down the company, it's like, oh, wait, why did your company fail? And so they've been running this survey for a while. So this goes across healthcare, this goes across IT, any number of the different spaces that kind of play in the Silicon Valley startup world. And so out of those, only 8% of them was because the technology wasn't right, that they had a poor product. Most of the time, startup founders get the technology right. And then in other cases, like, we've seen with some of our clients, regulatory, where like FDA doesn't approve your 510(k) submission, so then you shut down the whole program. I mean, that happens, and probably with good reason, right? You don't want a bunch of snake oil running around out there. But then the number one reason why startups fail consistently is there's no market need, that product market fit that was never really addressed, that the team got interested in tackling an interesting problem or an interesting solution rather than truly serving a market need. And so in 2020, when I first looked at this, it was 42% of cases. In the current funding environment, you're seeing more and more of the kind of ran out of cash and failed to raise new capital. But ultimately, I think this is something that could be addressed, is just figuring out, basically start with finding good product market fit first, and then you can start tackling a lot of the rest of them, because that ultimately is kind of your number one reason why startups would fail. And so what's interesting, because I didn't start in the healthcare space. I started in Home Depot as part of the in-house innovation team. And in that context, it's very much market pull, where in order to have any reason to introduce a new tool to the market, you have to start with proprietary customer knowledge as your starting place, because it's such a mature market. The healthcare space is almost predominantly technology push, where you've got the next Foley catheter, the next, heart monitor, the next technology. And so that then is what you're then pushing into the market, but it's not necessarily what the market may be asking for, because you might have a saturation of technology in the operating room, where do we really need one more robot looking over the shoulder of the open heart surgeon, who maybe there's something that they could just, existing solutions are good enough. And there's just too many robots in the OR anyways to just can get crowded out. So there's an interesting just kind of take on this. And a lot of what we've done with med design is start with the thesis that innovation should start with market pull in some contexts, as a way of differentiating from a lot of the other startups that are out there, and making sure we get product market fit right first. So that's just kind of a thesis statement there that we have. Okay, so now getting to the core of the talk, which is, what is a prototype? So if you start thinking about what a prototype is, a lot of times what comes to mind is 3D printed additive technology where you build something up and then, hey, you've got a thing. And part of that is because 3D printing became such a buzzword 30 years ago. And so that's kind of seeded everybody with that. This image here actually isn't a real prototype. That's or a real 3D printed prototype. It was something I went on Midjourney and had an AI generate for me. So, you think about kind of what a prototype could be. There's all kinds of interesting things that could be. So, but ultimately a definition of prototyping is it's a safe fail experiment that tests assumptions to reduce uncertainty and risk. And the background image that we've got here is like, storyboards about what your shopping experience might be as you go from Pinterest to Facebook to an app to ultimately having an in-store experience. And so storyboards can just be just as compelling of a prototype. So the range of prototypes you could have really should match the level of uncertainty and risk that are facing you in that moment in time. Okay. So then we need to get into a level, we're talking about uncertainty and risk, we're talking about placing bets, and we're talking about what our level of confidence is. And so, this is something that I think is interesting, particularly when we have people who are going from a healthcare domain into an entrepreneurship domain. You have or even like going from one entrepreneurial domain to another, you've got a level of confidence from your past history of success. And then you start dealing with the Dunning-Kruger effect. Is anybody familiar with this one? So it's a cognitive bias. So people with basically low ability or expertise in a new domain tend to overestimate their ability or knowledge. So you start off with hey, we're going to do this. And this is kind of the entrepreneurial seizure of hey, I'm going to do a startup. It'll be easy and I'll exit in 2 years. How many times have we heard that one? Yeah, Rick's there kind of feels the pain. That's right.
I love the expression peak of Mount Stupid.
That is actually in the diagram for Dunning-Kruger, right? Mm-hmm. Because you hit that peak. And honestly, this is with a cognitive bias, all of us that are human are subject to this. Because it's, anytime we plan out a new project, oh, yeah, this will be easy, this will be quick. The peak of Mount Stupid is when you hit, and then you then have the corresponding valley of despair when you hit reality of, no, this isn't going to be quick. This is going to be a lot harder than I planned on it. And then you're going to have a slope of enlightenment when you start actually making progress. And then at some point in time, you finally reach efficiency. But you have to go through all the innovation steps of figuring out where are you stupid to then get to the next stage. And we're all stupid in our own unique way. I'm perfectly willing to own my stupidity. So with lean prototyping then, and so this, we should then think about the cost of the prototype method used should match the level of risk, not confidence. We need to have some level of humility that we're stupid and that we just don't know where we're stupid yet. It'd be better for us to learn where we're stupid on the cheap rather than have to pay a lot of money to figure out where we're stupid. And so there's different levels of prototyping we can do in terms of UX prototypes, in terms of quick concept sketches and 3D printing. It just depends on where we are on our level of risk to then make sure we're managing that so we don't have to learn where we're stupid the hard way. Okay, so this is where the principle for lean prototyping comes in. And so then we talk about our initial progression where, we have our initial prototypes we're building up. And so the risk at those early stages is super high, right? So, and then as you make progress on this and reduce risk, then you ultimately try to get towards something that, is worth going through and doing a pilot launch. And so you then want to go cheap and fast at first and build on the strength of the evidence for that same hypothesis. And so that you're trying to reduce the underlying risk and uncertainty as you go. Yeah, Dwayne said that looks like a cool event. It was actually, that was a topic that came up during that roundtable at Project MedTech, where I started picking on the decision that some startups will make, where they'll try to go and buy steel tooling for their first run of production, which is the most expensive way you can do production. And I think that kind of turned some heads there as far as was this something we might actually, maybe we shouldn't only just go with a urethane casting to get started. Okay, so then I think it was, let's see, somebody commented on and was reading ahead to this slide where your cost of your prototype should match the level of risk that you're facing. So at high risk, you should spend a little bit of as little money as you can. And then as you have confidence and build up, then that's when you can build that out. And so then on a prototype progression, your first prototype should be really cheap and then build up. And so then you start asking that question of, well, is it 4 prototypes? Can you efficiently prescribe a certain number of prototypes? And so from an innovation standpoint, no, you can't prescribe that because it could be you need to do 8 prototypes or more in order to, fully arrive at something that's worth going through and putting that level of investment in. Okay, so ultimately, this is a iterative process where you expand out, you generate multiple prototypes to learn about what the possibilities are, and then you converge back down based on what you learned from those prototypes. And then after you have some certainty about that, then you can explore again, open back up, and then refine back down. But this isn't necessarily a linear process. Rather, it's one of opening yourself up to exploration, proposing a hypothesis, and then refining back down. Okay, so then, this is also kind of a look at the different types of prototypes that could be available to you. Actually, let me pause. Okay, Rick, I thought you had your hand up. Okay.
Yeah, I was looking at this, and a lot of times people will go through these things and will say, this is the way to do it. This is kind of the way to look at it. But they won't really, it doesn't hit them. And I don't know if you're saving this for the last or what, but as you go through these things, if, I know I wouldn't mind if you threw out an example of what it looked like when someone violated this stuff, when they tried to evaluate too many things in one prototype and it totally failed and nobody knew why, or something like that. Sometimes the horror stories, that you see somebody's got a Band-Aid, what happened? Well, I touched the stove. And that's when you go, man, I don't want to touch that stove. Do you have some epic fails, that, not that you've done, of course, because you and I would never, ever mess up on
None of us are
somebody
stupid,
else.
exactly, right.
Yeah, somebody else.
So one of my early engagements that I had was with a single point of incision laparoscopic surgical device that we were going through and doing some ergonomic improvement to. And I think, and it also is called the spider, which if anytime you're having something that goes into somebody and you're calling it a spider, like that, just kind of bad marketing. But the founding team was flush with cash. And so they decided, we want to make sure we fully validate this. I mean, it's a piece of surgical equipment. So we're going to use the highest volume production method we can and get some steel tooling for this. And I think they might have sold maybe 50 units. For just you think about the absolute waste of capital that came with not matching up the level of investment to the level of risk mitigation you've done to that point. So that was an early one that I saw that was like, ooh, maybe we shouldn't do that one again. Another one more recently is one where we went from one manufacturer to another manufacturer. And the first manufacturer went through and tried to build up they built up 2 complete full capital equipment pieces of capital equipment. And the one thing they were asked to do was a mechanical engineering component to solve this one thing that's critical to quality. And so that was their objective. There were a lot of other competing objectives, but that was the one thing. And there were previous prototypes that had been validated that successfully demonstrated that. Now, there's some ergonomic issues that complicated it. But the one thing that they were supposed to do, they got wrong because they tried to build up a complete prototype of 2 of them, in fact, that then when we got to testing it was, the actual amount of torque on that mechanical engineering component just, flat out failed to the point where I was driving that thing down the sidewalk in front of Duke University. I had people running out to help me because that mechanism was failing. And, it was just, it's just an epic failure in terms of, but what they could have done is done a works like lower resolution validation. We call it engineering validation prototype, that let's make sure this works in this specific, context, and then we can move forward. So I think actually this is a good, kind of slide to try to answer your question there, Rick, which is based on where you are in terms of risk mitigation, some things what does it cost you to generate a sticky note? Not much, right? It's like you can just whip one up. But then it's a matter of what do we need to do in order to evaluate the criteria or the specific element of this, and then what's the lowest cost way we can go through and get that validation. So I don't know, Rick, if that's a helpful example there, but yeah. All right, cool. So Loic, is that how you pronounce your name? Oh, you had your hand down. Okay, all right. Okay.
Unmuting time, sorry.
There you go.
Yes,
Right.
you pronounce it right enough. First of all, I see you call everything prototypes, and I'm more used to the concept if you want to find out an aspect of something, you try to pull them apart and you make a proof of concept of a single thing. So you make a lot of proof of concepts. And sometimes the combination of the thing is you have to prove. So you make a proof of concept of that. And from that on, you go to a prototype, alpha stage, beta stage, production stage, something like that. Are you only in the saying something about the prototyping phase, or are you combining them together?
So it's like snow. So Eskimos have 40 words for snow.
Okay.
And so describing that all of this is prototype.
Okay.
And so then there's different aspects of it. I mean, there's crunchy snow, there's like powder snow, there's like, so I think the confusion comes in where you start to think of a prototype as what you do right before you like make 1 million of these and make, all your money. And then the type of prototype that you pursue, it's all in pursuit of trying to learn. And so proof of concept, right? Paper prototype, boomerang prototypes, where you take somebody like a competitor's product and put your label on it just to see where their product is screwing up. Like there's all kinds of different ways of prototyping. Shop and chop, for example, where you pull up existing hardware, existing components, and then you see kind of like you break it up and you apply it to your component. I mean, there's all kinds of different ways of prototyping. Ultimately, the activity and the mental space is the same, where you're trying to learn. And so that's where I'm deliberately making the definition of prototype fuzzy, because there's so many different ways of doing it. And depending on the domain that you're in, can mean a lot of different things. But ultimately, I want to get this mindset right first. So that's at least how I'm approaching it. So,
okay. And then, of course, it's quite natural to hang dollar signs on each aspect. But usually when you start prototyping, then the availability of time and lead times and the availability of other resources are just as important as money. So sometimes it's prohibitive to do something because you don't have access to some resource.
Yeah. I mean, I think those kinds of constraints are, I think, part of the magic of entrepreneurship. And sometimes you can have too many resources and not have that forcing function of being creative and trying to figure out, okay, so especially during the pandemic, all of the prototype shops were shut down because they were producing those headbands. Like you couldn't get 3D prints done because they were mass producing those things. So then you had to get, if you wanted to get a 3D print done, you had to get creative. And so you had to find a different alternative pathway to doing that. And so there's just, I think the point I'm trying to make is there's a wide array of options available to you to generate a prototype. Whether or not the different specific capacities or methodologies are available to you is kind of another aspect, because ultimately you kind of have to make progress in the face of that adversity, which is any startup endeavor. So,
but sometimes it forces you to do the more expensive way of working than do the obvious way of working. I mean,
right, or an even less expensive way, where you're trying to figure out, is this good enough in order to make progress and build up our confidence? Or the other part is like, maybe there's other risks we're not aware of. And in this moment in time, we just don't have the resources to be able to validate one aspect of this. So then let's go through and let's validate the business model and focus on other parts of the enterprise that can be validated while we're waiting on, kind of additional funds or resources to come in. Because there's always opportunities to take risk out of the startup. And, then it's a matter of what can you do to get the most bang for the resources you have. So, yeah.
Okay, thank you very much.
Okay. All right, so then this probably might look a little bit more familiar for those of you who have done a risk and hazards analysis. Let's see, so where you think about risk, I mean, there's multiple dimensions to risk, and this is purely from an engineering standpoint of, or just kind of medical device efficacy, where you think about probability. So what kind of, how likely is this event to happen? And then how severe would it be? Is it catastrophic if this happens, or is it negligible in terms of, a certain risk, happening? So you can think about risk in these terms. And so a lot of what the FDA is looking for is, what have you done you can't perfectly take all risk out. That's just not possible. But if you can show progress towards making progress on the risks that are known, and then reducing the severity and probability of risk, and what have you done in the design of your device to take the array of risks that are facing you and make progress from the upper right down to the bottom left. And so that's just kind of a core framework for that. Okay, so Rick asked for some examples. I have some examples here of different prototypes we've done. Okay, so the first one is we had a client we're working with, wanted to develop an app, and it was all around packaging or all around packing for a hiking trip. And so one of the ideas that we're looking at is, well, wouldn't it be cool if we had some machine vision you could take a picture of all of your stuff and be able to recognize each of the objects in there to develop a packing list. Okay, cool idea, right? So in order to test this, did we go through and build up an AI? No. All we did, this was the cheapest prototype I think we've ever done for AI, which is we went through and we arranged, one of our designers arranged a bunch of stuff, and then went through and built up a mock-up of, oh, hey, here's what the machine vision might do to recognize all of these objects. We then went and tested that. We said, like, okay, so for people who were potentially using this app, would you want this feature? And we had a resounding no. So rather than staff up a whole AI team to build out this app and go down this, like technical rabbit hole, we learned this wasn't a good idea with like just a little bit of Photoshop work and like some clever photography. So this is what you can think of when it comes to testing an early stage idea. And then this is another example of this is a speech language pathologist who was working with children with cleft palate. And so then we're trying to come up with a gamification app where there's a device that basically like a retainer that gets implanted in on the patient's teeth, where it has a sensor that can detect whether or not the tongue is correctly placed on the retainer. And so then the question is, from a gamification standpoint, can you engage the child in the correct pronunciation of the word "the," which I had to visit a SLP when I was a little kid. So
You mean the.
Joe can give you some coaching on that. So then it's a matter of like, did they pronounce it correctly? And so then you have that gamification of maybe there's pet rewards where you're feeding your pet, or we came up with multiple different games. And so these are just wireframes that could then get evaluated and figure out which of these games are most engaging, that the child lights up and like, oh, this would be fun. And then that makes sense to then go through and build up the whole model and then iterate further. But low resolution prototypes like this can be very helpful in figuring out like, okay, we think about gamification, well, what would the game actually be? And then kind of give enough of the story to be able to figure out, is it worth pursuing further? In another case, this is a startup where the founders were part of the founding team of Intuitive Surgical. And we've been working with them for years. And we've been looking at this idea of, how do we communicate the ergonomic concept? And so the technology itself is a catheterized transeptal mitral valve replacement device. So where before you had to do this through open heart methods, this is basically through the catheterized, modality. And so what's interesting here is, in order to be able to do this, the technology has 6 different axes of movement in order to be able to properly position this. And so the ergonomics of that is actually really challenging, because you don't actually have a mental model for how do you go about doing 6 axes of movement. It's actually really challenging to get somebody to understand if they've never experienced that before. So that's so as we were going through and building up these different concepts, we then arrived at a overall kind of user experience for this that would make sense for that context. And then as we got into the actual ergonomics of the device itself, because you do have an interaction with that, we then were asking a question of, we've got a lot of components that need to get stuck in here. So then how do we make sure that it's easy to hold, that the experience of actually holding this makes sense? And so in this case, this was some blue foam, insulation foam I got over at Home Depot, and then mocked it up really quickly. And that's a skewer, like a kebab skewer. And then that's also my daughter's hand, she's 9 years old at the time. And so we're looking at the first percentile hand size. So this is the furthest extent that somebody would potentially need to be able to grasp this element, so we could then make forward progress. And so there's a lot of, from a technical feasibility, there's a lot of really cool engineering behind this. But this image that you see here is kind of their pom-pom that's on the front page of the website, that they've then been able to raise $5-6 million based on being able to have just a clear, concise representation of, there's all kinds of really cool complicated technology, but here's what the experience is for the surgeon using this device. So I think that's an interesting way of using a concept illustration to then describe what the experience looks like. Okay, other examples. Or actually, so then kind of getting into like, as you're planning out your prototype, then how do you sequence this out, and how do you basically like figure out which of the questions do we want to address first? because in the venture, you've got any number of different questions you're asking in terms of desirability, feasibility, viability. And then if you're thinking more socially responsible or sustainability, you're kind of looking more broad other than just kind of the one and done disposable device. And so then you start getting into an overall planning process of, like mapping out a prototype plan. So having a research objective, our team wonders, ... will this aspect, work or not? And then to test that, we will, perform a certain activity. And then here's our metric. How are we going to, actually understand if it worked or not? And so then you use this as a framework to then evaluate whether or not you've done the right things. I think there was a question earlier about, if you've got too many different attributes that are baked into the prototype, then how do you know? And so you want to break it down to make sure you're taking one aspect of this and then figuring out like a pass fail on this. So this has worked, yes or no, then we can continue to build upon that. So having that kind of discipline before you go into the prototype is really going to help make sure you're maximizing the amount of learning you can get out of the specific prototype. So, all right, let me pause there because I know I've been talking for a while and that's usually risky. So
I wouldn't mind if Sue Carr were to share what she wrote publicly and why she feels that way.
Well, I guess I'm still an entrepreneur. And I kind of took the whole path. I'm a pharmacist by trade. I saw a problem with the filtering of ampule-based medication. If you don't know what an ampule is, it's a kind of a sealed glass tube that has medication in it. But to access it, you have to snap that neck. And when that happens, glass shards get into the medicine and you need to filter it so you don't have glass shard contamination in the bloodstream. And that process involves multiple needles and multiple steps, which can lead to needle stick injury. So I came up with, I saw this problem as a technician and I worked in retail and then went back to hospital and saw the same problem and like saw nurses and doctors not performing the process properly. So I came up with a solution and our first prototype, our alpha prototype was, I thought fairly expensive. I mean, it was like $6,000 and that was like 10, 12 years ago. But when I look back, I can see that was fairly cheap because now we're, and I called it not the spider, but the frog, filter removal of glass. So now we're preparing for FDA submission coming up in the next 3.5 months. And we've gone through the iterations and it took us about a year just to refine the filter. I don't know why we couldn't use the same filter that BD or B. Braun make, but we had to come up with our own filter. And actually it's a really, really good filter. So the big needle companies are going to be jealous one day soon. Well, or else they're going to work with us. So I have kind of gone down that path and now our next iteration for FDA will be the beta prototype, but it's still manually built. So it's still fairly expensive, but then we'll move on to mass production. So I've taken those steps and I didn't know I was going to take them and I don't know that I would do it all over again, but here I am today.
That's incredible. You're at this point, though, that you've persevered through all of that and that you're at a point now where you're going through and doing the FDA application and you've learned from each prototype and kind of built up. And it sounds like you've got some novel technology with the filter and which is part of the core value. And like, you wouldn't know that in advance.
No,
that's part of the innovation experience. And, the other thing too, is like companies like BD don't have people like you in their organization. And they need entrepreneurs to then be able to have something to scale up because the efficiency mindset would have squashed your project.
Yeah. And actually we're working with BD, so it's all good. They recognize that needle sticks alone cost hospitals, I think, $3 billion annually to treat. And I was at, actually, I don't know if Trinity Health is a global health organization in my area. I live in Maryland. There's Holy Cross, and then there's which I used to work at in Silver Spring, and then I opened up a new hospital in Shermantown, and they had opened up a cancer center last night. They had a celebration, so I was there, and the foundation leaders and some of the thought leaders and the ones that make the decision makers were there last night, and the president of the hospital wrote me a handwritten letter and was there, came up to me last night, and it it felt good. They're like needle stick injuries. We want this in our hospital. So they'll probably be one of our pilot hospitals. But it's been a long road.
That's amazing. That's really inspiring. I hope you continue to kind of see more progress and that just takes off. And it sounds like you're solving a very significant unmet need in the market, and you're seeing a response from having like gone through this journey and come out on the other side with something that's truly helpful and actually solves the problem. That's amazing.
Thank you. Yeah. So I'll be a success story in about a year. And we have other iterations that are down the line. And I think I just got an NSF grant. So
I don't think you're a success down the line. I think you're a success today. Everything you put out is you getting recognized and money. So yeah, it's not a bad place to be, said Joe Hage, her investor.
Thank you, Jeff. And I promise I'll register and figure out my
Yes, I know.
Okay. I can keep rolling through just a little bit more of kind of what we've been up to with med design.
Rolling.
Yep. So we talked a little bit about that at the beginning of the call, where med design, it was sponsored through UNC's Fast Tracks with the Translational Research Group, and the idea was to provide initial practical training for healthcare providers for really just essential entrepreneurship skills. And so our thesis was a good design starts with empathy for all of the stakeholders. And so the image that you see here is a clinic called KindBody, and you wouldn't expect a healthcare clinic to look like this. But I think the surprising aspect is that good healing can come from having the environment that you're in, the types of products that we design, be thoughtful and well designed and reduce errors in use, because it's intentional and well thought through. And we've reduced a lot of the risk that comes from, basically not really thinking things through and thinking about the entire experience that comes from going through the healthcare system, because it's certainly a problem-rich environment. So then we think about some of the success stories that came out of med design. So this was one of our first groups. And so this was Team Respiro, Dr. Piazza and Dr. Lampman, where they identified the need for, as patients present at the emergency room from shortness of breath, that the types of diagnoses that the different ER docs might come up with might be wildly different. And so they were looking for a simple device that could be used as part of the early triage to then route, is this COPD, is this heart failure, is this pneumonia, because the types of diagnoses might be life-threatening depending on which pathway they go down. And so we went through, and this was the storyboard that was kind of part of their final pitch presentation, and that they were then able to go on and do validation that actually, you know what, there's another startup that's a couple $1 million ahead in funding that's looking at the exact same problem with a very similar technology. So they're able to recognize that, you know what, this is interesting. We've got good validation that the process was right, but we're able to stop progress on this and then go on and do something else. And we didn't go through and do basically raise a bunch of money to pursue something that was already being done in the market. So they gave us permission to actually show this off, where most of our stuff is under NDA and we can't show it off. So this was an example of a success story of, we didn't spend any more money than a couple of weeks on this, and some beautiful illustrations we get to show off. Another success story came from our second pass at running this workshop. And so this is around digital health, remote patient monitoring for patients with high blood pressure. But in this case, this was a group of academic researchers and physicians and clinicians who hadn't worked together before this workshop. But then it was the collaboration of these different stakeholders were able to come to agreement on a very complex and challenging healthcare circumstance, to then make sure we had alignment on what is the problem we're really working on, and what types of solutions can we pursue. And so then the testable concept storyboard that was the result of this collaboration, there were a couple of these, was looking at, when you send a blood pressure monitor to a patient who might be elderly in a rural context, where they're getting this device in the mail and they're not quite sure what to do with it. They're worried that there might be some kind of exposure risk to their data. So they're just, they're anxious about that. So then the solution came up with was, okay, well, what if we have a tablet experience that opens up, there's training videos, maybe there's a telehealth component to it. The data informatics that's available from that is then clearly communicated to the patients. So as a result of this, Dr. Halliday was able to win a $5 million grant to further this work and put it into practice for patients in rural communities in North Carolina. And so she directly attributed that to the workshop as a way of getting alignment across these different stakeholders and to have an early prototype that could be included in her grant to show forward progress. So that was just kind of a neat one to be able to showcase. And so she's been one of our biggest supporters as we've been going forward. So the content itself, we have made it to where it fits in the clinician's busy schedule. So it's a series of 30-minute pre-recorded videos. We then have designed it to where the clinical teams just need to meet for an hour independently to work on the material. And then we've got an expert coach who then works through the content with them to make sure that we're making forward progress on each of those elements. So it's been designed to slowly introduce the information at the time that they need it so that we're not overwhelming busy practicing clinicians and physicians, but rather doing it at a cadence where they can trust in the process, make forward progress, but then not have it be too much all at once and focus on one thing at a time. And so then, seasoned biomedical design coaches walk them through that path. And then what's been interesting about this is that at a pattern recognition level, we've been seeing lots of teams go through this process. And so in some cases, we have more device-specific challenges, which is somebody comes in and they say, hey, I have this very narrow medical device problem. And so then the work that we're doing is trying to open them back up to then look at the broader context and use case around a very narrow device solution. And there's others where the problem scoping is a little bit different, where we're looking at clinic improvement problems, where the complexity of the care for a patient population is very broad. And then we're trying to narrow that down and bracket it down to more achievable problems. And so finding the right scope is something that we've been seeing kind of differences in how to go about that. So that's been interesting.
Hi, could you enlarge the image on the right? Curious about
the image on the right.
Yeah.
Oh, I actually can't. So that's the curriculum we go through on the actual the content of
the slide show, and you zero in on just that slide. You could probably, but I'm taking you.
Yeah. So that's this component here, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So with this, if we zoom in, this is actually the digital whiteboard. So I'd have to pull one up. So with the digital whiteboard, this is the interactive component of this. So as we're going through and doing this work, then, and if you give me a minute, I can pull one up, where this is where we walk through the progression of content where, let's say we get into need statement development, then we're asking the teams to put down their thoughts on this in a collaborative way. Let me pull one up here because I just ran this talk with some of the students actually here, I'll share this one. Hold on a minute. If you want to see what we're up to here, I'm going to drop this in the chat. All right, so this is an example here of what we're doing. So I'm going to share my screen again, but if you click on that link, so it might randomly assign you to an animal because you're coming in as a visitor. So if you come in and you're randomly assigned as a spider or something like that, and you don't like spiders, you can just refresh the page. And so then you come back in as like a panda bear or something like that. So anyway, so this is an example of, in this case, the workshop we were doing with the UC Berkeley students was around gum disease for short snout dogs. And so then we asked them to go through and improve upon a need statement. And so with this, so this is part of, say, like the week 3 of the curriculum, where we're saying, okay, we've got a given need statement, and then how might you improve upon this? And so we've got criteria for developing a well-written need statement, that it's solution-free, that it's scoped, it's specific, includes a metric, it's verified, and it's poetic, it's pleasant to the ear. So this is, kind of week 3, I'd be speed running through that content. But this is an example of kind of what actually happens in our workshops. And then as we get into planning and prototyping and all of that, then, then we get into the application of this. So anyway, you're welcome to poke around in here and kind of see some of what we're up to. It's not the full
As your
content.
marketing friend, I think this could sell people on your courses that look really well thought out and structured, as though this isn't just some BS promotional material. Like I'll actually be able to use this.
And that's the intent behind this. I've been wondering how much of it to show, because if you show too much, you give away the content, but you do start.
I don't subscribe to that.
Yeah.
How often have you gotten like, here's everything I know about such a thing? You may have even downloaded it. Did you read it? Maybe, but what percent? No, I'm not concerned about, well, what's the point of showing up if I just give you everything? Because talk me through it because I don't have the mind space to really delve in. And if I sat and talked with the author, it would really sink in. If you want to blur out a thing or two, have at it. But the most successful campaign I ever ran for Michelle Lott was giving away basically her crown jewel report by showing that it's serious, but blurring out like the really good parts. And she had hundreds of people request it.
I read about 10% of what I download.
If that, you're ahead of me.
Well, thank you for that.
Lord writes, it would be great if all our customers went through this process.
And the hope for this is something where we transform how the industry works, and that there's a standard training, because you think about the med school curriculum, right, where anything that smells like innovation gets squashed. And so the medical school training isn't really, supportive of this. And so there's a big gap in understanding when you do have, clinicians who come to you and they're then complaining about the $2,000 prototype, when like that's a bargain. But there's not that training and understanding. You're coming from an efficiency mindset, not an innovation mindset. And so being able to offer this training is something we're hoping to change the culture of how healthcare approaches innovation. And we'd love to just have this as something that's a scalable model that, we've gone down the path of being able to offer CME credits for people who take the course, so that there's a common understanding, at least, of what, is involved with healthcare innovation.
So you get most of your clients through they are entrepreneurial physicians?
The engagement model that we've got here is around trying to help shape the clinician engagement through UNC Health, and that's been the grant funding process that we've been pursuing.
And that's euphemistic when you say physician engagement.
Right.
Are you saying physicians sign up for our course and develop products through our company? Is that what that means?
They're signing up through the course. They're getting an educational product. Now, whether or not they sign up and hire trade to do their industrial design work, that's a different issue, because, ultimately we're also trying to figure out whether or not they'd be a good client to work with.
Right. But the point is that physicians in their daily lives are coming up with ideas and determining whether they are viable.
Yes.
Where it's fruitful for you to shop, because I don't know of a lot of your competitors that are using that as their primary ground for growing their business.
Yeah, no, it's our thesis is that the physicians, clinicians are the source of meaningful innovation in healthcare if you're taking a market push approach. And so, but to do that, there's a big skill gap. And so we're offering a training product
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
I think you even just happened upon a tagline for yourself about how you see physicians at the center of medical device innovation, because even that isn't something that I often hear. I'm often hearing something more like, yeah, I mean, you know what it's like to get a doctor. They're gods, and they're not used to this and that, and they have no idea how to this and that. I hear it, physician innovation as a diss more than I do here are the guys that are and gals who are going to do it.
Yeah,
so for you to position yourself that way would be different, I think. Rick?
I think it's the physicians are, definitely the source of the problems that need to be solved, in a sense of they understand where the shortcomings are. As far as being innovators themselves, obviously there's been a lot of negative connotation around physicians being innovators and doing the innovation themselves, but they are certainly the source of the issues that are necessary to be solved.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, York. Rick?
Depending on the customer, I have some customers who are very, very intelligent about their development process and everything, but that's not true across the board. There's just a real variety. So I try to make sure that whoever they are, they have a good set of expectations for what we're going to get out of the entire process and every part of the process, so they don't get too many surprises. And one other thing to do is most of them are cost conscious, and So what I'll do is I'll publish I'll send them a link and I'll say, if you hit that from your phone or your computer or anything like that, they'll instantly get a status update on where your project is, what it's costing, and what was done during those hours. And so there's when I was in my first few years of this, ended up with situations where people got surprised by how complete the project was or how much it was costing, and making that information available to them so they could, anytime they want to, have their own dashboard of what their project is doing. That just eliminated those conversations because there were no more surprised people. And so sometimes it's figuring out what they really need to see and helping them manage those expectations.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, just having good, project management and also education. I think some of our failures have come from not clearly explaining what the purpose of a prototype is. And then you try to have an efficiency frame on the prototype. And then, no, we've learned the lesson. This was successful from what we set out to do with the prototype. But no, you can't go mass produce this. Like, that's not what we were doing. That's not what we were trying to accomplish with this. And so it was, Jorg, is that how you pronounce it? You made a great point that as we've been going through and learning this, that we found that the physicians were great in the empathy section, that they could clearly articulate and come to consensus on what the true problem is. And then when it came to the creative section, where we're pairing them with designers, and designers' creative flywheel are running at 90 miles an hour, and then we're getting other people's flywheels to come along a little faster, then they're happy to participate in that process and learn from that, and then also provide an effective filter so we don't wander off into the creative clouds, but we're grounded in like a deep understanding of what the problem is. But yeah, I think that interplay is one where I think at different points in time in the enterprise, you need different skill sets. But I think we're kind of all finding that that physicians are kind of where things get started. And then from there, it's a matter of what skill sets do you need to bring in order to effectively bring something to market. And yeah, that's just kind of a question for each venture there. So yeah. Jan, you put down a comment. So it explains why your last company had skunk works groups, usually about 7 people separate from the larger company. Absolutely. Do you want to elaborate on that a bit?
Yeah, they would find something going on and decide they needed to develop it. So they would take certain engineers that weren't actually fitting into the normal production work anyway, and then scoot them off with a project leader who could help figure out what they were doing, develop the costs, see what other kinds of things were necessary to report, and get their money they needed. And they do all this stuff until they got something that was almost production worthy. And then they'd bring it in and we would refine it to actually fit in our system or develop the new lines to do it. So it worked pretty good, and we were quite innovative with a lot of our products that way. Got to know a lot of doctors and clinicians, and I liked it because I do packaging and I want something, just give me an idea of shape and size and weight, and I can figure out how to package it and sterilize it. So it was fun to work with them. Mm-hmm. But then Abbott decided they cost too much and quit. So they just go out and buy innovative stuff now instead of developing it themselves.
Yeah, it's more efficient that way.
Not very innovative and helpful for the doctors, though.
Yeah, very cool. I see that we're over on time by a little bit. I mean, Joe, how long do we run for this? Do we kind of hang out? Or?
We're good when we exhaust ourselves. If someone else has something to add, we do. But typically we stick to around an hour because we're going to be together in 7 weeks.
Yeah, very
and
good.
We can hang out over ice cream and other things. If you saw ResMed CEO Mick Farrell signed on to be keynote, and Maurizio was gracious to just talk the next day or so. And last year's keynote, Dave Albert, is returning. So pound for pound, I think this is the strongest faculty I've ever assembled. Go tell your friends. And I'm really looking forward to that. Next week, a business school friend of mine who's at Cleveland Clinic we'll talk about how they approach venture investing. I think that'll be really interesting. And Ty, I hope you can come for that, because I imagine a lot of the people you're trying to work with would love to have a Cleveland Clinic audience. That's it for this week for Joe Hage and Joe Hage Enterprises. This has been Joe Hage featuring Ty Hagler. Thanks, everybody. See you next week.
Thank you.
Bye.
Have a
You're
great
welcome.
weekend.
Yeah.
Bye.